see it. So this is where we started, where we stopped last time. I was telling you about three great countries having their possessions in America, on the territory of North America. It was British possession, French, and Spanish. And around 1750s, New France started to expand, and the French started going southwards, as I had told you last time, towards territory which they called Louisiana. But in fact, in Louisiana, there weren't very many permanent settlements, right? There were not really very many French people. There were just some separate settlements, but the French did not flood the whole territory. They just claimed it without actually settling there. At the same time, the King of Great Britain promised to the inhabitants of the 13 colonies that the territories west to the colonies will be theirs, right? So everything that is in the Appalachian Mountains and to the west of Appalachian Mountains. And there was a conflict between the French, who already had taken Louisiana, but as I said, there were very few of them, in fact, in there, and the colonists who wanted to go westwards. And this led to a military conflict between Great Britain and France, which today is called 7 Years' War, and this is the name of the conflict in Europe. And also it is called French and Indian War in North America. Well, the explanation of the first term is obvious, right? It is called 7 Years' War because it lasted 7 years. Although this is what the historians say, this is a continuation of a larger conflict that took place in Europe, but we won't get involved in it. We don't have time for it, as well as we don't have time for explaining in detail the involvement of the Indians in it. Anyway, according to the historical sources, the conflict lasted 7 years between 1756 and 1763, hence the term 7 Years' War. But in America, it is also known under the name of French and Indian War. And the reason is that the Indians, or native inhabitants of America, they sided with the French. And they had reasons to side with French rather than with the British. Because British, they were mainly farmers. They were plowing the land. They were, first of all, clearing the land. So they were removing the trees, and they were turning forests into fields, which Indians disliked because they had a completely different attitude towards soil. Native Americans, they did not consider something like ownership of land. You could cultivate the land, you could cherish the land. It was like your brother or sister, but you could not really own the land. It was something beyond their comprehension. Hence they disliked the, so to speak, the British, while the French, they were not really settling there. They were not farmers because most French were trappers, so they went hunting for animals and they sold animal furs, but they were not destroying the soil, the land. They were not cutting trees. They were just moving from place to place and settling somewhere, but they were not destroying the surroundings. Hence, Indians sided with the French and helped them in fighting against the British. But this help was unsuccessful in the sense that after 7 years of conflict, eventually the French, they surrendered, and a huge portion of land became American. So this is what the North America looked like after the war. So you can see that the French are virtually only here, while everything that had been French here in the north part of America, in present Canada and Louisiana, became British. And British in this way became the greatest empire in the world. A moment for looking at the map. Here, I'm going to mention it later on, actually by the end of this lecture, but a part of what had been French also got to the hands of Spanish. But this is another thing, because in Europe, I'm going to repeat this sentence many times during this lecture or this series of lectures, that whatever happened in Europe affected America. And in Europe, there was a problem, a conflict between the Spanish and the French. And as a result of this conflict, the French gave up a portion of land for the sake of the Spanish, right? So Spanish started to own this portion of land, and Mississippi River became the border between the British and Spanish right now. Yes, so here is Mississippi River, and the British have a new neighbor. Now, these wars, these conflicts were quite costly, right? And in Great Britain, the people who paid for the wars, who paid for the army, upkeeping of the great army on another continent, these were the most influential people, the rich members of British society. So they were governing Great Britain. Yes, they had all the power in Great Britain, but at the same time, they had on their shoulders the burden of upkeeping the empire, yes, in financial terms. And now that the 13 colonies expanded to this huge territory, someone had to guard it, yes. The fact that one conflict with the French was victorious and that the British won did not mean that all the conflicts were over. Well, first of all, there were new problems with native inhabitants, with Indians on the territory of America, including this name. You don't have to remember it. I just dropped it for you to, if someone is particularly interested. But there was this Ottawa chief, Pontiac, and he had many followers, and there was this conflict between native inhabitants and British colonists, and soldiers from Great Britain had to be sent to America to help colonists win this conflict, which happened, right? Secondly, colonies had this new neighbor, Spain, and while Spain was a weak country, weak power, if I may say so, in the previous century, in the 18th century, it was quite a strong country, and it was not a neighbor to be neglected. So again, soldiers were needed to protect the new border between the colonies of Great Britain and colonies of Spain, yes, and Spanish possessions. So as you can see, the cost of winning the wars, winning the conflicts, of sending the soldiers, it was all on the shoulders of British wealthy men. And at this point they said, well, the territory is expanded, someone has to protect the colonists, so the colonists are going to pay for their own protection. We no longer intend to pay for the upkeeping of a huge army that is kept in America, in North America. And in order to carry this out, they passed the so-called Quartering Act. Quarter is a place of living, right? So Quartering Act issued in 1765, as you can see, but this date you don't have to remember, it's just a kind of reference point for you. It's in fact, in practical terms, it was taxation, right? So American colonies, they were taxed to upkeep the huge British army on American continent. They were to provide for those soldiers food, shelter. If the army quarters were not enough, they were to provide place of living, furniture, food, well, actually everything, right? But colonists said no, right? We don't like it because we don't mind paying taxes to our local governments, to our colonies' governments, because we participate in them, we can influence them. So we can pay to our local governments, but we have no representation in the British government. Why should we pay to Great Britain, right? So they said no taxation without representation, right? So eventually the act was introduced and colonies were forced to pay sorry, for the army, but they did it very, very unwillingly. And from this moment, we can say that the relations between Great Britain and the colonies, American colonies, started to get a bit worse. The introduction of the next tax did not help. It was the so-called Stamp Act, introduced soon after. And again, well, this was new type of tax in the sense that all kind of printed matter was taxed. So calendars, books, newspapers, everything that was printed was taxed. And American colonists didn't like it either. And they started to boycott American products. Do you know what a boycott is? Do you know the word boycotting?
It's like being against, I mean, striking.
Yes, so they were against British influence, and they started to actively oppose it by not buying British goods. And you need another explanation. In the colonies, there were very few factories, right? Mostly colonists were exploring natural resources, raw materials. They were sending those raw materials to Great Britain. In Great Britain, these materials were manufactured, which means they were turned into ready-made products and sent back to colonies as ready-made products. So the profit of the empire was huge anyway, right? Because they got those raw materials, they could develop their own industry and sell back the products to colonists. Not all colonies were satisfied with that because they could not actually develop, well, their own factories, their own industry, because, well, colonies were in those times mostly farming areas. Yes, so they were actually living from farming and sending those goods on and trading with Great Britain. I just got lost. Well, I wanted to say about those taxes, right? And so they were buying goods from Great Britain, and now they boycotted British goods, which means they stopped buying products from Great Britain, right? Very many colonists said, well, if Great Britain taxes us, if they want us to pay money, we are not going to make them earn by, you know, selling the products to colonies. So colonists, many of them, not all of them obviously, but many of them stopped buying British products. So Great Britain lost a lot of money, much more than they would have earned by imposing the taxes. So as a result of this boycott, this kind of revolt against Great Britain, all taxes were withdrawn. But they were withdrawn for a short period of time. And again, after well, several years, the taxes went back again. And this time, lots of things were taxed. It was lead, paper, glass, and tea, right? One of the things that were taxed was tea. And tea was a very popular drink in the colonies, well, for obvious reasons. Most of colonists were British, and British loved tea, so the colonists also loved drinking tea. And well, they disliked the fact that tea is also taxed because they would have to pay more money for the tea, and they started smuggling tea to the colonies. There was a feeling of distrust and anger between colonies and the British, right? Because the colonists had this feeling they are not equal citizens, they are like second-class citizens, that they are not equal to the citizens, to the subjects of the king in Great Britain, they are differently treated. And as I said, there was this growing distrust. And one event happened, which is called today the first step towards American Revolution. And this is the so-called Boston Massacre. Namely, in Boston, there was a tax collector's office, right? So a place where those colonists paid taxes, which they disliked. And this tax collector's office was guarded by a British soldier, the so-called Red Coat. I will show you in a moment the uniforms of the British, but they were red, very well visible. And as it was March, there was snow everywhere, still snow everywhere, and a small boy started to throw snowballs at this soldier. And there was a group of boys, they started throwing those snowballs, and this soldier felt that he's in a kind of danger. As I said, it's all because of this distrust and kind of tension between the British and the colonists. And this soldier called for help, so more soldiers arrived. And on the one side and on the other side, there were those boys and a group of local people, of Bostonians, looking at the situation, right? And at a certain point, the crowd of people went forward a little bit towards the soldiers, and the soldiers could not bear the tension, and they fired at the crowd. And 5 people were killed in the process. So this is what happened. Whether this can be called a massacre is just the matter of judgment, right? Because we can say that only 5 people were killed. But later on, but first of all, the satisfaction of colonists was even greater. And after most of the soldiers were released and only 2 were punished with very light punishment, this dissatisfaction of Bostonians and generally of colonists was even greater. And this event took place on 5th of March, 1770, and many people consider this event as the first step towards American Revolution, because it was an event which made colonists realize that the relations between colonies and Great Britain will never change, right? And something has to be done about it. But at first, even when colonists were thinking of a conflict with Great Britain, they were not really thinking of breaking free from it. They were fighting for equal treatment. Yes, so American Revolution was approaching, the satisfaction of colonists were growing, but I want you to realize that at the beginning, at least, most colonists, they didn't want to break independent from Britain. They wanted to be treated just as equal citizens, the subjects of the king, the same as people who were living on the island, British island, right? Now, so the time was going on, and again, after the massacre, there was kind of time of peace, and again, the taxes were withdrawn, all of them except tax on tea, right? Which led to another event. So in 1773, the situation was not really improving much, although many taxes were withdrawn. Then there was still this tax on tea, which was being smuggled, and people were buying actually from smugglers and not from, in official British shops, because first of all, tea was much more expensive in British, it was bought from the British, and besides they wanted to boycott again this tea from Great Britain. And now I'm going to tell you about what happened about the Boston Tea Party in 1773. If need be, I'm going to repeat everything twice if you want me to. Anyway, there was a company whose name was East India Company. And this was a British company which was almost going bankrupt. It was in a very bad financial condition. And this company, it was trading tea from India, from in Asia, right, from India to the British Isles. And it had lots of tea in their warehouses, yes, in Great Britain, huge amounts of tea, but they couldn't sell it to the British market because they would have to pay a very high duty tax, right? So if they wanted to distribute the tea which they had in British warehouses to the British market, they would have to pay a lot of money, but they didn't have the money. On the other hand, the British government wanted to help this company. The reason was that this company was very influential in India, which was another British possession. It could influence British government, right? So if the British government lost this company, then they would also lose the influences on the Indian government. They didn't want it. And the British government said, well, this is our advice. Why, instead of selling the tea to the British market, why don't you sell the same tea to the colonies? Then you wouldn't have to pay the very high duty tax, but only very low colonial tax. Yeah? So sending the tea to America, to American colonies, would solve all your problems. And this is what happened. So the tea was loaded on many ships and it sailed towards colonies. But colonies revolted, yes, they boycotted the tea. So in some ports, American ports, the ships with tea were sent back to Great Britain because colonists said, we don't want British tea at all. In some other ports, the tea was unloaded, but it was placed in wet places, in wet warehouses. So it got damp, it absorbed water and was completely ruined. It was useless. The problem was with Boston, because in Boston, the governor had two sons and they were merchants. They were trading, yes. And he thought that if the tea arrives to Boston, his sons may sell it and profit on it, yes. So they are going to make a lot of money on selling this tea. So he said, this governor said, let's unload the tea from the ships. But Bostonians, people who lived in Boston, they disobeyed the governor. And as the story says, at night, dressed as Indians, the Bostonians threw all the tea to water, right? So they just were throwing the load to the ocean. And that's why it is called the Boston Tea Party, right? From this time, all the tea was lost in this way. And of course, Great Britain got angry, right? And they closed the port in Boston. They actually made a kind of blockade and said, no ship is going to get out of Boston or in Boston until all the tea is paid for. Colonies are going to pay for the lost tea. If they don't do it, they are not going to sail anywhere, right? So this was kind of condition imposed on Bostonians by the British. Is it understandable? Do you want me to repeat or explain a part of the lecture, of this part of the lecture once again?
So did they actually pay for the tea, or did they just leave the ships there?
They didn't pay because soon after that, the revolution started. They had no intention of paying at all. So there were lots of British soldiers in Boston, well, all over colonies, but particularly many of them that were in Boston. They blockaded the Boston or blocked it in a sense. And this is the moment when colonists understood that it's not possible to solve the conflict with the British on peaceful terms. And this is the moment when the First Continental Congress gathered, right? Here you've got the term, the First Continental Congress. It was the meeting of representatives of all colonies in Philadelphia. They met and they discussed their problems with Great Britain. No substantial decisions were made during this meeting. No specific movements were decided on, but this was an important meeting of representatives of all colonies, because for the first time colonies started to act as one. Yes, they were like one body, united against Great Britain. So the Congress, the representatives gathered, they discussed the problems, and then they went home. However, in the meantime, the so-called Minutemen started to practice to fight against the British. Minutemen, these were volunteers, these were colonists who were practicing how to fight with the British, because they actually at this point they started to prepare for a military conflict. And they were called Minutemen because they were ready to gather within a minute if need be, right? So if there is the beginning of a revolution, they said, we are going to gather within a minute and fight against the British. They were drilling, they were practicing, and also they were gathering supplies and guns and gunpowder near Boston in Concord, right? So here is Boston, as you can see. Well, you can't see it actually, but there were lots of soldiers in Boston, British soldiers, and from there, the army of British soldiers went. I'm going to mention it in a minute. Anyway, not far away from Boston, as a kind of preparation for the oncoming conflict, the colonies started to gather those supplies. And it so happened that in 1775, the British who were in Boston, they found out about those supplies. Yes, they discovered it. And in April, they started going towards Concord to take the supplies over, right? To destroy as if the intentions of the colonists. But as they were going towards Concord, they met the army of Minutemen. It happened in Lexington. And there were two battles actually. The colonists won, and the British, they had British soldiers, they had to go back to Boston. And this event marks the beginning of the American Revolution, and the date is, it's not this one, as you can see, the 19th of April 1775, the beginning of the American Revolution, and at the same time this is the date of the battle at Lexington. And a moment to contemplate the map again. Okay, now I'm not going to tell you in detail about, you know, the battles and what was going on in this revolution. Well, however, some important things did happen, right? So when the revolution started, many people actually didn't want to participate in it, right? They said, well, we have relatives in Great Britain, and the same actually happened in Great Britain later on, right? Many people who were on the islands, they said, well, our relatives, uncles, and, you know, grandfathers went to colonies. Why should we fight with them? They are members of our own families, right? So on the one hand, there was this will to begin a revolution to change the situation, but on the other hand, many people really didn't want to participate in it. But after the first several battles, the situation changed, especially in colonies, and we can divide colonies into as if three groups. One group, around 1/3 of all colonists, these were loyalists, right? Loyalists, these were people who sided with the British king. They didn't want to break off from the British crown. They said, we are loyal subjects of the king and we never want to leave the British Empire, right? And they were like 1/3 of all colonists. Then on the other side, there were patriots. these were those who believed that it's not possible to come to resolve the conflict in peaceful way, and that Britain is never going to treat them on equal terms, and they wanted to break free from Great Britain. So these were patriots, again, 1/3 of all colonists. Yes, and once again, patriots, those who wanted freedom from Great Britain for the colonies. And that was this last 1/3. These were those who were disinterested. Yes, there is always a group of people who simply don't care, and this was another 1/3 of all. So there was kind of balance between the, sides, as if. Now I'm going to mention, I'm sorry, just very few battles. First of all, there were many of them, right? And there is no need to mention all of them, but some of them must be mentioned. One of them is the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it is important because it showed differences in the style of fighting between the British and colonists. Here you've got a scene painted from this Bunker Hill battle, and you can see definitely two things. So first of all, that British soldiers they wear here red uniforms. They were called redcoats, right? And this means that they made very good targets in the battle, right? Even if there was smoke, kind of dust, they were well visible, and it was just very easy to shoot them. On the other hand, they were in ranks. There was this style of fighting inherited as if from Europe, that soldiers were standing in ranks. You can see here like a straight line of soldiers, another line before them, and usually the first line was kneeling down, body next to body, and people behind them too. So they were really easy to fight with. And Bunker Hill, this was a battle won by the British, but only because of the fact that colonists ran out of gunpowder, right? But they were like, several battles within one battle, and colonists were winning all of them. But when they eventually ran out of, supplies of gunpowder, then they lost. On the other hand, there were colonists who were learning how to fight from Native Americans, right? And Native Americans, they were like, trying to melt with the surroundings. So they were not really wearing bright colors. They were hiding behind bushes, behind trees, and they were dispersed all over area. They were not fighting like with the British, who were, standing person next to the person, but they were dispersed all over area. So this helped the British, the colonists prevail on battlefields. Although many of them were lost because of this, lack of supplies. Okay, so the fighting was going on, and when the battles were still, taking place, the Second Continental Congress gathered. And if you remember, the Continental Congress, it was the meeting of representatives of all colonies. And when the war was still going on, they met in Philadelphia, and they made very important decisions. So first of all, the Second Continental Congress decided that now it is the government of the colonies, right? So the people who gathered in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress, they called themselves the government of the colonies. Secondly, they called the army fighting in the war the colonial army, and they made George Washington its leader, right? So George Washington became the leader of Minutemen, but now they were not called Minutemen, but they were called an army. And the third important decision was to print colonial money, right? So they decided about the printing of money. So this was like the first step towards emergence of a separate country, a separate nation. And then the people who gathered in the Congress, seeing no possibility of coming to somehow communicating with the British, they decided to form a committee which would write the Declaration of Independence. So indeed, a committee, a special group of men gathered to decide on the content of the Declaration of Independence. And eventually it was signed, it was written and signed. So, fighting was still going on around. Yes, the revolution was in full swing. And while the revolution was going on, all these events also were taking place, and the declaration was signed on the 4th of July, 1776, right? And I have just very few requests for you to do something extra apart from listening to those lectures, but I would like you to read the content of the Declaration of Independence. It's just one page long. I'm not sure whether you can see it, but behind me in the frame there is the text of the Declaration of Independence. It's not really very long. It's like 20 minutes of reading. It is my recommendation that you do it, right? So the Declaration of Independence was signed, and we can say actually that the 4th of July 1776 is the date of birth of another nation, and this is the United States of America. This is when the nation was born. But the fighting was still not over. Yes, the revolution was in full swing, as I had said, and there were more and more people convinced that breaking free from Great Britain, this was a good movement, a good decision. And one of those people was Thomas Paine. Here is his name. He was a man involved in politics who wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And this is another reading for you, because Common Sense was, again, a very short text. It's like 2 pages long, in which Thomas Paine convinces people to side with patriots, to side with those who want to break free from Britain. And among things that he writes about in Common Sense is profits that colonists are going to have if they decide to break free from Great Britain, right? So, for instance, you are going to read it, but one of those points is that they are going to be in economically better position because their industry will develop, right? So far, most industry was developing in Great Britain because all raw materials were taken away from colonies, sent to Great Britain where they were manufactured. And now he said, well, you are going to make your own products. You will not be dependent on what Great Britain sends to you. Yes, but you are going to make your own products. And this was one of many signs, of many arguments of Thomas Paine when he was convincing people to side with patriots. And he did, right? He was quite successful. And many people, after having read Common Sense, they decided to change sides or join in revolution on the side of patriots. Now, the fighting was still going on, and one of few other battles I'm going to mention is Valley Forge. It was a famous battle for 2 reasons. One, that George Washington, who later on became the first president of the United States, participated in it. But it was also like a miracle for colonists. In Valley Forge, this was a place where colonists were surrounded by the British. It was the middle of winter. It was very, very cold, right? And those colonists were living in like in log cabins. I mentioned those log cabins, but no heating. Yes, they had no source of warmth. They were hungry, starving, desperate, surrounded, as I said, by the British. And it so happened that among them there was a German drill master. And this German soldier, he taught all the other soldiers how to fight in difficult conditions, right? So they started practicing with him, and finally, almost by a miracle, they managed to break free from this siege of the British, despite the fact that they were desperate, cold, hungry, and so on. So this was another famous battle of the revolution. And finally, there was this Battle of Saratoga, called the turning point of the revolution, because so far, nobody was winning and nobody was losing, yes, for the first 2 years of the revolution. So some battles were won by the British, some by colonists, and actually no one was really winning. But this was the turning point of the revolution, right? After Saratoga, really the British started to lose. What is more, the colonists got the support of the French. At first, French were reluctant to participate in this revolution because they said, we just lost the 7 Years' War. We don't want to lose another conflict on American continent. But after they saw that in Saratoga, colonists are really determined to win. After all, the colonists were fighting for their own freedom, for their own lives, yes? And the British, they didn't have this motivation. It was just another of many colonial possessions. It was expensive. They had their relatives in there. So the British were not as determined as the colonists were. And after the Battle of Saratoga, the French saw that there is kind of promise of winning the war, and they helped colonists, right? Both financially, so they gave them, they lent the colonists a large amount of money, and also they gave some, some troops, some groups of soldiers, some fleet, so ships, and this ended in eventually winning the revolution. Okay, we will cut this long story short. After additional several years of fighting, it stopped in 1781. Here is the map. Okay. So in 1781 in Yorktown, this is where the war ended. Yorktown was surrounded by the colonists from the side of land, while the French surrounded Yorktown from the side of the ocean, from water, with their fleet. And when Yorktown with British soldiers inside surrendered, it was just the end of the war. But the negotiations with the British were dragging and going on and on until 1783. So for another 2 years, because the British, they had difficulties with admitting that America is now an independent nation, right? They didn't want to say, well, now we accept you as another new country. So it took 2 years until eventually this treaty was signed. So that's all for today. And this, what troubles America had in the beginning of its independence and how those troubles were overcome, you are going to find out next time. Now it's time for questions. No questions as I can see. So that's all for today. Thank you very much and see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.